In the Torah, in Numbers chapter 5, we come across what many readers have felt to be an extraordinarily disturbing ritual, one that deserves at least a little bit of analysis. In the book of Numbers, Israel has come out of Egypt, they're in the wilderness, they're being given instructions for all kinds of things, all kinds of ways to set up their sacred places, a building, a movable building they call the tabernacle. And in the midst of all this, in Numbers chapter 5, beginning in verse 11, we receive a rather strange situation. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if any man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him, if a man had intercourse with her, but it is hidden from her husband, so that she is undetected, though she has defiled herself, and there is no witness against her since she was not caught in the act, if a spirit of jealousy comes on him, and he is jealous of his wife who has defiled herself, or if a spirit of jealousy comes on him, and he is jealous of his wife, though she has not defiled herself, either way, just if the spirit of jealousy is there, then the man shall bring his wife to the priest. There's an offering, and the priest brings the woman before the Lord, and there's a ritual that occurs. I'm skipping down now to verse 23. The priest shall put these curses, various kinds of curses, things that would happen to the woman if she's guilty, into writing, and then wash off the writing into this water of bitterness, along with some dirt from the floor and some other things maybe. The woman has to dishevel her hair, verse 18. And she drinks this. And if she drinks this, and if she's innocent, all is clear. Nothing happens. However, if she drinks it and she was unfaithful to the husband, the very thing he suspected, the water that brings the curse shall enter into her and cause bitter pain, and her womb shall discharge, her uterus drop, and the woman shall become an execration among her people. If not, though, the Lord has freed her. She's immune. She'll be able to conceive children in the future. So that's the basics of the ritual. In Jewish tradition, this is called the sotah, sotah being the word for the female adulterer or the adulteress. What is adultery exactly in the Old Testament? A rather old-fashioned term. Readers of the Hebrew Bible might be surprised, or maybe not, to learn that really in ancient Israel, at least in terms of these legal codes, adultery is very focused on married women, and particularly what married women do, not so much on men. So, for example, adultery, strictly speaking, at least as it's defined in Leviticus, I'm thinking of Leviticus 20, verse 10, and in some other places, really is about what a married woman does with any kind of man, a married man or an unmarried man. Whereas it's not as though it's exactly encouraged for unmarried men to have sex with an unmarried woman, or for married men to have sex with an unmarried woman. Definitely frowned upon, for sure. But it's not treated with the same kind of severity. Leviticus 20:10 has one of the famous laws, meting out the death penalty for adultery, but being very clear that it's about a married woman, right? So what's happening here? How are we supposed to think about this exactly? Well, this issue of and in fact, if I go back to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, and both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. But it assumes someone catches them in the act, which is the exact problem in Numbers 5, right? No one has caught this woman doing anything. She's not been, there's no proof. There's no proof at all. There's no proof of anything except just the husband's jealousy, which is treated with this, I don't know, this amazing kind of disturbing deference. Like, what if the woman is jealous? Why is his jealousy such a big deal? You know, people deal with these kind of things in relationships today, and you know, sometimes people are just told, like, look, like, I've been faithful. There's nothing here. You just have to get over it. Like, this is your problem. This is not my problem. In Numbers 5, though, the jealousy becomes the woman's problem so severely. How do you solve an accusation like that? This is the only place in the Bible, a very unique text, where we see something that might be called a trial by ordeal. A trial by ordeal. Trials by ordeal essentially put the person under accusation into the hands of God, into the hands of a miracle, and ask for some kind of natural circumstance or some kind of miracle to save them. In the ancient world, Hammurabi's Code from about the 19th or 18th century BCE, the 1700s BC, we read of a lot of trial by ordeals, a lot of them against women. The idea that if a woman is accused of this or that crime, maybe witchcraft or something like this, she's thrown into the river and the river decides. The text is ambiguous. Like, what do you mean the river decides? Like, is it essentially a test if she knows how to swim or not? Or like, what, is the idea if she makes it out of the river? Maybe, presumably something like that. You can imagine trials by ordeal that essentially are concocted in order to exonerate somebody, where the ordeal would be something that one is likely to survive and to do okay. Or you could imagine ordeals that would be designed essentially to prove people guilty 100%. Kind of like maybe like burning somebody and saying, this woman is a witch, we will burn her. If she burns, she was a witch. If she does not burn, then she wasn't, right? I mean, so you have kind of like the conclusion is built into a situation like that. The Hammurabi's Code Babylonian River ordeal, I don't quite know what to make of that. I don't even know that we have enough information. What about this ordeal here in Numbers 5 then? Are we supposed to think that this concoction of dirt from the tabernacle floor, or this ink that's written and then scraped off, is this something that we're supposed to think under natural circumstances? Let's say you assume that there was no miracle here. Are we supposed to think that the woman would actually get sick from this? And then if she did get sick, would all these things happen to her uterus, and would she be unable to conceive? I confess that I don't know the answer to that. Off the top of my head, I'm kind of thinking this doesn't seem like the kind of ritual that would actually make a woman's uterus drop or fall out or make a woman infertile. So if you just removed the divine element from it entirely, it almost seems oriented around proving the woman's innocence in that sense. Maybe I'm just grasping here. But this problem of the no witnesses in all other places, someone has to witness a crime. It's not just about jealousy. Something else to point out here that's really fascinating is the way that writing in this text is considered a numinous power, that it has some kind of magical effect, that it has just a power in the written words themselves. The priest doesn't just speak them over the woman, but rather it's the physicality of the words themselves that go into the woman as she drinks this potion. Scholars who have studied this have seen multiple sources. The text is very repetitious. I decline to read all of Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 through 31 here because it's very tedious to read. When scholars see repetitions like that over and over again, they assume that there are multiple literary sources in this. What do multiple literary sources mean? Well, it could mean that there's a long process of transmission for this text, or it could mean that scribes who passed this along and the communities who passed it along had problems with it and felt like they needed to somehow clarify it or amend it or fix it at various points. You could, of course, read this yourself and ask, does this seem like a single coherent, cohesive law, or are there other levels here of the writing? There are some difficult to translate terms. Scholars will wrestle and wrangle over the issue of particularly the language in verse 27. This language of the curse entering the womb, the bitter pain, the discharge, the uterus dropping. I'm reading from the NRSV here, but there are different ways maybe to understand some of this. Not completely clear. The obvious perspective today, as I've already mentioned, is this feeling of gross gender inequality, right? Why would a woman be subject to something like this and not a man? I definitely don't have a great answer. I'm not Bible defender man here in this video to say why a ritual like that should feel okay, nor can I solve these really looming problems about patriarchy and the economics of marriage and sexuality that people have pointed out in ancient societies or even in our own world today. I mean, when people are upset about the patriarchy and patriarchal values, they're typically upset not just about obvious things like this, but about this issue that somehow, when it comes down to it, women are really considered a type of economic object. I mean, that is the idea behind adultery being connected with a married woman, right? It's the idea of lineage, the idea that you wouldn't want a married woman to bear a child which is not her husband's child because it would confuse lineage situations. And so people who have criticized the patriarchy on all kinds of fronts could point to the kind of economics of marriage and the way that this has played out over many, many years. Can't solve that, not an expert in that. Are there any redeeming qualities to this text? Is there any way we could soften it? I've done some reading on this. I had to do a little bit of a deep dive on this in some ways, and I can't repeat all the things that people have said for the sake of time. I'll repeat a couple of things that I've read that people have written that I don't know if I find them compelling to solve the gender problem here that I think many contemporary readers would see, but I think they're worth thinking about. One thing is we could recognize that what this text does recognize is that in a traditional culture, in a patriarchal culture, in a culture where maybe it would seem as though men don't have a lot of checks on their power, that this ritual actually recognizes that out of control male rage or jealousy is something that has to be dealt with, lest it get out of control or lest it lead to innocent people being injured. So the text has, you could say, a very real world kind of perspective here about the irrationality of men, the runaway out of control emotions of men. It's a rare text which gives you a kind of, even if it's a negative insight into the idea that of a man being overly emotional, paranoid, suspicious in a way, not merely imputing those values to women, but also recognizing, yeah, this guy who's suspicious, maybe she did it, maybe she didn't, but she probably didn't. And he's kind of spiraling about this, right? Another thing that I've read that people have said about this is that it even with the lack of a witness and by the trial by ordeal, assuming a person thinks that there's a real God overseeing this, it has the potential to definitively clear the woman of suspicion, right? So I'm the jealous husband, I'm out of control, my emotions are spiraling, I bring my wife in for this ordeal, she passes. What now do I have to say, right? And I've pointed out from a purely secular perspective, I don't know how many women would actually lose their uterus and lose the ability to conceive after. I don't want to downplay the idea of drinking this gross potion, right? I'm not trying to downplay that. I'm just saying, what's the actual physical harm here? I'm not sure without any kind of divine, intervention or miracle here that it would cause a woman's womb to discharge and her uterus to drop, right? So it definitively clears the woman, one could say. And also related to these things, I pointed out already Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, has the death penalty for adultery, right? This text, interestingly enough, if adultery is found to have happened, does not prescribe the death penalty for the woman. And you could even say that this is, in a way, at odds with Leviticus chapter 20, which does say if she's committed adultery, they die, both of them, both the man and the woman. But it has to be involved with a married woman specifically, right? In this text, the punishment that would be divinely or miraculously meted out on the woman is actually quite directed at the organs of procreation, the uterus, and so on. And so it actually mitigates against the death penalty and makes the punishment less severe than death. Still very severe, of course, for a woman in an ancient society, in a patriarchal society, in a traditional society, to lose the ability to bear children. And of course, terrible to be accused of adultery at any rate, especially if you're innocent. But this text operates on a presumption of the efficacy of the divine involvement in the ritual, right? So if you assume that, if the woman is innocent, now she's fully cleared, the male rage has been dealt with, put in its place, and the woman, even if she is guilty, she doesn't receive the death penalty for the adultery. Do these things fully get us out of the dilemma and kind of make us breathe a sigh of relief? I don't know. Maybe not. To speak on this from a male perspective, as I do, maybe just, I can't quite get us there on that one, okay? I will bring up one last point, though, that's fascinating. In the Mishnah, a Jewish document which is a kind of a commentary on the Torah, which was produced in the first few centuries of the Common Era, right? So after the time of Jesus, we have the Mishnah, which is a commentary on the Torah. There's even then a commentary on the Mishnah, and then this is what Jews would call the Talmud. And in Jewish tradition, there's not such a strict dividing line between the authoritative interpretive communities in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and the Torah itself. These things kind of work together in tradition. So that's a fascinating concept. In the Mishnah, there's a whole section on this text called Mishnah Sota, which has a fascinating conclusion about this text. Namely, that this ritual ceases to have relevance and will cease to be performed in Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple. Of course, was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD, 70 CE. Why? Why this ritual? Why would the Mishnah declare that this ritual should no longer be practiced? Well, one reason maybe is that there's no more temple. And if you have to get the magical dirt, right, the dust, this is from verse 17, the dust from the floor of the tabernacle, or then later the temple, if that's the dust you have to use to make the trial by ordeal work, but then you don't have a temple anymore, then clearly you can't really do this ritual very effectively, right? I think it might even be in the Mishnah, the reason is that it's just too chaotic, that there are too many trials like this, and they can't possibly really do this. One does get a sense, though, maybe, behind the lines of the Mishnah, that there's a feeling here for that interpretive community, that this law is fundamentally unfair, or that it's fundamentally unenforceable. Nevertheless, it's a strange one, and the only place in the Bible where we receive a very clear trial by ordeal as a way to try to solve a problem that a community has.